Kit, you're so famous for your style, which is an amazing mix of old and new and colours and patterns. What sort of role would artisanal products play in creating this look, in your look?
Well, do you know, we've always loved craft, and craft has very often been the little sister to art. But now it's coming into its own. And what we love about craft is it's often generational. So you'll get great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and husband and wife very often all within the same craft. For example, with baskets and ceramics, we were talking to Dylan Bowen the other day, and he was saying the same thing. Every one of his family has made a pot, and there's a simplicity, but at the same time, if they made 10 pots all the same, they would all look different because they're made by hand.
And that look is so important to you within your interiors, to have something that is completely original and unique. It's important for you to have unique things within the spaces you're creating for your guests.
I think it gives interest to a room. And if you can have someone like a businessman who's so disinterested really normally in his surroundings, to suddenly touch a pot or look at a fabric or just be surprised by his surroundings, then I feel that we've achieved something. And so often something which is unique and made by hand creates what we're looking for.
Do you find, because a lot of craft is so humble and a lot of craft now is also extremely elevated, how do you feel the two sit side by side? Do they have a place together?
Well, I think that when I commission art, it's very much the artist who's the main person. And yet with craft, so often the craftsperson is almost anonymous. But that is changing now, actually, and the dynamic is changing. But what we're interested in is actually the travel part as well. It's not just England. It's what we call folk art, whether that's the right word or not, I don't know. But you can actually mix a number of different sort of handmade articles from all around the world into one room, and they work together. And I think the one thing that unites them is that individuality of thought and the craft that goes into it. I love it when the colours sort of change because they're thread, they come to the end, so there's slightly different colour that comes through. And some people would find that worrying. I love that.
Yes.
It's almost like meeting every member of the family as you're actually looking at an embroidery or an artwork.
Yes.
And it's inspired so many of the things that we've designed ourselves.
Absolutely. I love that on where you see on narrow looms that they use, because for practical purposes, they could either carry them on their backs or they could fit inside their houses. People had to work in small spaces, and because of that, you get rugs and textiles where they've joined the strips together.
Yes, yeah.
You see that?
Well, the ikats are really very narrow, and they look so simple, but actually when you look at the number of colours and how you must understand the warp and the weft and the actual design itself, you suddenly realise that they're practically geniuses. And I could never do it in a million years. So actually, sometimes they're so beautiful you just want to frame them.
It's interesting what you're saying about the different types of craft. You have the sort of the quite high craft maker who designs and makes, and then you have the more indigenous craftspeople who work as communities producing something they've always produced for a long time that might not necessarily be considered trendy or contemporary by Western standards. Have you worked with these sorts of communities to create something that perhaps you feel sits in a more contemporary surrounding? Perhaps you've changed the colours, or have you worked much with commissioning craft?
Yes, we commission a lot of craft, and very often it's interesting to mix it up. I mean, we can get a carpenter who could be working with a ceramicist and then make a shelving unit where the actual ceramics become the uprights within the shelving unit. And then changing the way that legs work, and then in fact making a perspex top to a coffee table and putting either a wonderful fabric or ceramics within it. So it almost becomes like a little display case on its own. But I think what's wonderful about craft is that very often with age, automatically there's that teaching of the next generation. And for example, Joe Hogan, who's living in Connemara in Ireland.
He's a basket weaver, isn't he?
He's a basket weaver, and he adds driftwood and stone into the mix of his baskets. But also he's teaching at the same time. And I think that is so important, because if you have one generation where they lose that knowledge, it's very difficult to get back again.
I think this is one of the interesting things about a lot of the projects that are being run abroad at the moment, which is where charities are investing in local craft, but also investing in educating and teaching craftspeople how to also be business people, because in a way that creates perhaps more of an appetite for the craftspeople to stay working as craft if they know there's a business element that they can understand and run themselves, if they can run their own books and if they can promote their own work and find their own clients, as opposed to just, producing stuff to order from middleman. I've worked with some brilliant weavers in Maheshwar in India. Is an entirely woman-run organisation in what is traditionally a male-dominated area, which is hand weaving of cloth. And these women are producing for the Indian market, but also very much for the Western market too. And because of that demand from the Western market, they're able to make proper money. Their salaries have completely, it's quite interesting actually, they're making something like 80% more than the men make locally who don't work for the charity. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these women who are working are either widowers or they're divorced. And if you're a widower in India, there's still a huge stigma attached to that within these small communities. And actually you can be left entirely dependent on your community if you don't have a means of making money yourself. So,
it's also a confidence-giving thing, I think, as well. If you know that you're good at something, suddenly you can stand up straighter, and you feel just that you can approach life in a much more aggressive and wonderful way, in a good way, I think. And that's for men and women. Over here, I work with fine cell work, which is working in the prisons.
Yes.
And very often, and it's the men who are actually doing a lot of the sewing, but very often it's the first time that anybody has ever told them that they've done something beautifully or done something well. And it's a very simple thing, but it's the first step of actually moving forward and changing your life.
Absolutely.
And so it's not just the sewing, it's then making it into something. So if you can add it to upholstery or just making a chair look beautiful, then it's you're making that one step further. So rather than just having a fabric, suddenly it's an ottoman or it's a footstool. And then you're getting together with other craftspeople. And I just find that organically things grow if you have creative people together.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sort of shared the ideas that flow between people. And I think, like you were saying, the pride is really wonderful. That feeling that somebody can see a piece of fabric they've created upholstered on a piece of furniture thousands of miles away in a place that they'll never go, and never, that sort of knowing that little bit of them is there does give them enormous pride.
And I noticed that on the Christopher Farr stand last year at Focus, they had brought over actual weavers and people that were makers from Afghanistan. And that must have opened their eyes enormously to all the other things that are happening. And in fact, one of my sort of fabrics, which I designed called Travelling Light, which of course is influenced totally by sort of ethnicity and travel, they had taken this fabric and then had woven in and embroidered and embellished it in such a way that it was almost unrecognizable and so beautiful. So it's amazing how one thing leads to another.
And also that idea of sort of many hands. I think one of the wonderful things about antique designs, indigenous antique textiles and designs, are that they were once designed by somebody, and we often don't know who the original designer was. Now we sort of set huge store by intellectual property and copyright, whereas so many designs, we have no idea where they've come from, and we're just applying a modern hand to it. But I think there's something very lovely about that idea of the evolution of a design, a bit like you're saying, with this piece here, which we can see on the curtains here as well, in another colourway. Its roots lie in something very traditional from very far away, and you've brought it into a very modern context before sending it back to Afghanistan to be reimagined once again by hands who are used to crafting in traditional ways. And then what was the finished product like?
They had embellished various areas which I hadn't even looked at before, and added sort of leaf designs and almost like a bit of beadwork onto it. So it became 3D. And of course, as soon as you make something multidimensional like that, it's always much more fascinating to look at.
Sounds like it needed framing.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I would do that. I mean, actually, if anything sort of is there long enough, I'll frame it. Oh, dear. Because collections are also beautiful as well. So if you can get a collection of different glassware or ceramics, or it doesn't even matter, actually, sometimes shoes. We've had collections of shoes before. And I can imagine collections of wonderful slippers, with little toes that turn up like this, all in a row, will look so fascinating.
Beautiful.
And can you imagine that the original people that made them would never expect them to be displayed in that way, and they will then start looking at them again. And also just things like things that we throw away, things like egg boxes, or even sort of tubes that go into washing machines and things like that. Suddenly, in Africa, where they make the most amazing wall hangings and even sort of guitars out of old petrol cans, there's that wonderful sense of reinvention.
Yes.
And looking at things in a whole new way.
Yes, I think that's brilliant. The sort of the elevation of the very prosaic to something, and then it's on the wall of a hotel in South Kensington. And if you were to sort of think of a room that didn't have those things in, and then think of the room with those things, what really is it that you think these pieces are bringing to a space and offering the people who are inhabiting that space, who are coming into it and looking? What are they sort of taking away from it?
Well, it's soul. It's sort of duende. And suddenly when you have, because that actually is what a living room is all about, isn't it? And you create that in your own home so easily. Within a hospitality space or within a hotel, you have to introduce that, but not in a sort of high-heeled way, not in a way where it's going to date and look too fashionable. It looks as if it has to be. And that's what actually a craft very often can do, with its imperfection, with its simplicity, with its uniqueness.
In fact, what you're doing is you're creating, it's all about creating a look that is completely of its time now, and a look that is completely of its time now is made up of many different times and places in history and people who've contributed to the thing. So actually, it's the very opposite of a one-dimensional interior.
I think what makes an interesting interior is it doesn't take something large, just something small, something found, where you need to go back into that room again. It captures your imagination. A really good interior is one where you don't take it all in the first go. You have to return again and again. And so often a piece of craft is something which captures your imagination.
And how do you feel about, as you're working on new projects, and obviously your style is evolving all the time, and you're constantly, I imagine, looking for new pieces to commission or antiques to buy, and what are you excited about in the future for future decorating projects?
I think, we sort of bounce back from situations. So although, and I think life is either feast or famine. At the moment, it might be a bit more famine than feast, but we will bounce back. And the world is a smaller place. And I think all the, as a sort of whole sort of human race, it's very homogenized. And I think people actually almost want to look back to their past. And it doesn't matter where they come from, whether it's Myanmar, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Africa. Suddenly it's important to pull from that. And very often you just see the smallest things in interiors, which actually is something that reminds them of their past. We put in our Manhattan bar in the Whitby in New York, 57 different baskets from all over Great Britain. And it's a brand new building, so we had lots of different craftsmen within the space. We had Chinese, South American, Irish, American. And the one thing is that when the baskets went up above the bar, first of all, it was a Chinese guy who was doing the electrics came up and said, "Oh, Chinese baskets. We made these at home." And then a South American guy came over and he said, No, they're South American. My mother made these. And then somebody in Ireland said, "Yes, but that was on the back of a donkey when we had one at home." And so it was so extraordinary that these hulking great men from all these different countries were brought together by a simple basket.
That's so lovely. That sort of slightly reminds you of what you were saying earlier about find cell work and these kind of, ex-criminals who are sort of, trying to find salvation through beautiful, beautiful things. So for you, the future of projects will very much continue to be about commissioning original work and finding original craftspeople.
Absolutely. And they can then get so successful I can't afford to actually even use them anymore. So I have to find new ones.
Yeah.
So yes, that is the excitement of it all. And it's watching someone sort of turn from a chrysalis into a butterfly and fly away.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kit. That was really brilliant and really interesting to hear about how you build your interiors and the craftspeople you work with.
Thank you.